When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, church bells rang across Europe and beyond. Crowds poured into the streets in celebration. Yet for millions of families, there was no celebration, only silence. Sons, fathers, brothers, and friends would never return home. Their absence left empty chairs at dinner tables, unfinished dreams, and a grief that reshaped an entire generation. They became known collectively as the fallen of the Great War, soldiers who never made it back home. The scale of loss. World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history up to that time. More than 16 million people died, including approximately 9 to 10 million military personnel. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Industrialized warfare, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, submarines, and aerial bombardment turned battlefields into landscapes of devastation. Entire units could be wiped out in a single morning. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, with over 19,000 killed. For many towns and villages, especially in Britain, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the loss of young men was so widespread that it permanently altered community life. The reality of trench warfare. Most soldiers who died in WWI did so in the trenches of the Western Front, a vast network of muddy, rat-infested ditches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Life in the trenches was defined by constant fear, disease, and exhaustion. Soldiers endured endless artillery bombardments, sniper fire, gas attacks, freezing winters and flooding, limited medical care. Many who never made it home were not killed instantly in dramatic charges. Instead, they died slowly from infected wounds, gas exposure, or illnesses such as influenza and dysentery. The 1918 influenza pandemic alone killed thousands of soldiers who had survived combat. Battles that consumed a generation. Several battles became synonymous with staggering loss. The Somme, 1916, over 1 million casualties on both sides. Verdun, 1916, approximately 700,000 casualties in a 10-month struggle. Passchendaele, 1917, known for horrific mud and over 500,000 casualties. Gallipoli, 1915 to 1916, a disastrous campaign that left deep scars in Australia and New Zealand. In these battles, progress was often measured in yards gained at the cost of thousands of lives. Soldiers advanced into machine gun fire across open ground, knowing survival was unlikely. Letters home frequently carried both hope and resignation. The unknown soldiers, not all who died were identified. The chaos of artillery explosions and trench collapses meant many bodies were never recovered. As a result, nations created tombs for the unknown soldier, symbolic graves representing all those who never came home. White crosses and headstones stretch across cemeteries in France and Belgium, marked with inscriptions such as, "A soldier of the Great War known unto God." These graves stand as reminders that many families never received closure. Some parents died not knowing where their sons lay buried. The emotional toll at home. The impact extended far beyond the battlefield. In some British communities, entire football teams vanished. In France and Germany, a generation of young men was severely diminished, contributing to economic and demographic instability for decades. Women entered factories and farms in unprecedented numbers, reshaping social roles. Children grew up without fathers. War widows faced financial hardship and lifelong grief. Memorials were erected in nearly every town, each engraved with names that local residents still recognize today. More than numbers, behind every statistic was a human life. A farmer who left his fields behind, a teacher who promised to return to his classroom, a teenager who lied about his age to enlist a poet like Wilfred Owen, whose words captured the horror before he was killed 1 week before the armistice. These men carried photographs, letters, and dreams in their uniform pockets. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas 1914. Few imagined it would stretch on for 4 brutal years. Memory and legacy. The soldiers who never made it home left a legacy that shaped the 20th century. The trauma of the war influenced art, literature, politics, and international relations. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, attempted to create peace, but instead contributed to instability that would lead to World War II. Every year on Armistice Day, November 11th, and Remembrance Day, people observe moments of silence. Red poppies, symbolizing the flowers that grew on the battlefields of Flanders, are worn in honor of the fallen. Their sacrifice is remembered not only in stone monuments, but in family histories and national identities. When the war ended, the dead did not simply fade into history. Their absence reshaped nations in ways both visible and invisible. Entire landscapes bore scars. Shell craters filled with rainwater, forests shredded into splinters, villages reduced to rubble. Yet the deeper scars were carried in the hearts of survivors. For those who returned, survival often came with guilt. Many veterans struggled with what was then called shell shock, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They were haunted by the faces of friends who had fallen beside them. Nightmares, trembling hands, sudden silence at the sound of loud noises. These became part of daily life. The war did not end for them in 1918. For the families of the missing, grief was complicated by uncertainty. Thousands of soldiers were listed as missing in action. Without a body, mourning felt unfinished. Mothers held on to hope for years. Wives refused to believe official notices. In some cases, families continued writing letters to men who would never read them. The fields that still give up the dead. Even today, more than a century later, the earth of France and Belgium continues to reveal the remains of those who never came home. Farmers call it the iron harvest. Each year, plows uncover rusted rifles, helmets, and unexploded artillery shells. Occasionally, human remains are discovered. When identification is possible through modern DNA testing, descendants, sometimes great-grandchildren, finally receive answers after more than 100 years. This ongoing recovery reminds the world that World War I is not only history, it is still physically present in the soil. The Lost Generation writers and artists who survived the war describe themselves as part of the Lost Generation. The term captured not only the dead, but also those who returned disillusioned. The optimism of the early 20th century, the belief in steady progress in civilization, had been shattered. Poets such as Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen wrote of the horror and futility of trench warfare. Owen's haunting line, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, challenged romantic ideas of glory in battle. The war left Europe politically unstable. Monarchies fell in Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. Revolutions erupted, borders shifted, economic hardship and unresolved resentment created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. The men who never came home were part of a chain of events that reshaped the global order. The role of memory and remembrance. In the 1920s and 1930s, memorials became sacred gathering places. Annual ceremonies brought communities together in shared mourning. The act of remembrance was not only about honoring sacrifice, it was about ensuring that such devastation would not be forgotten. The red poppy became a symbol of remembrance after the poem In Flanders Fields by Canadian physician Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. The image of bright red flowers growing among graves offered a fragile symbol of life emerging from destruction. Moments of silence, observed at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, create a bridge between past and present. For 2 minutes, nations pause. The quiet echoes the silence left behind by those who never returned. Individual stories, eternal impact. Though history often speaks in millions, remembrance is personal. In small towns, plaques still hang in schools and churches, listing names alphabetically. Young men who once ran through those same halls. Some were barely 18 years old. In Australia and New Zealand, Anzac Day carries profound national meaning. In France, nearly every village square features a monument aux morts, memorial to the dead. In Germany, somber stone markers reflect the weight of loss. In Canada, the memory of Vimy Ridge stands as a defining national moment. Each nation tells its story differently, yet the shared thread is universal. families who waited at train stations for soldiers who never stepped off the platform. A warning written in stone. The soldiers who never made it home from World War I left behind more than grief. They left a warning. The mechanized slaughter of the Great War demonstrated how modern technology, nationalism, and rigid alliances could combine into catastrophe. It showed how quickly diplomacy could collapse into destruction. The rows of identical graves stand as silent testimony to the consequences of failure to resolve conflict peacefully. Yet within that tragedy lies a powerful reminder of shared humanity. On Christmas Eve in 1914, soldiers from opposing sides famously emerged from their trenches during an unofficial truce, exchanging small gifts and even playing football in no man's land. For a brief moment, enemies recognized one another as human beings. That fragile spark of compassion remains one of the war's most enduring images. Closing reflection. The soldiers who never made it back home are not merely figures in textbooks. They are part of living memory, woven into the identity of nations and families alike. Among the most powerful reminders of soldiers who never made it home are the letters they left behind. Millions of pieces of correspondence crossed borders during the war, folded pages filled with longing, reassurance, humor, and fear. Some letters arrived after the writer had already fallen in battle. Parents opened envelopes stamped with military insignia, only to learn, days later, that their son had been killed weeks earlier. In other cases, the final letter became a family treasure, creased from being read again and again, its ink slowly fading, but its meaning never diminished. Many soldiers tried to protect their loved ones from the truth. They wrote of good weather, strong spirits, and nothing to worry about, even while enduring artillery bombardment and gas attacks. Their final words often reflected hope. "I will see you soon. Save me a place at the table. Tell little Sarah I'll bring her something from France." For countless families, those promises were never fulfilled. The youngest and the forgotten. Not all who died were seasoned men. Thousands were teenagers, some as young as 15 or 16, who lied about their age to enlist. Patriotic fervor, peer pressure, and a sense of adventure drew them to recruitment offices in 1914 and 1915, when the war was still believed to be short and glorious. Entire groups of friends joined together in what were known as PALS battalions, particularly in Britain. They trained together, fought together, and often died together. When these battalions were sent over the top in major offensives like the Somme, the losses devastated single communities in a matter of hours. Streets that once rang with laughter fell quiet. Local businesses closed. Sports clubs disappeared. The impact was concentrated and deeply personal. Colonial soldiers far from home. World War I was not only a European tragedy. Soldiers from across the British Empire and French colonies fought in distant lands: India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Senegal, Algeria, the Caribbean, and more. Many of these men traveled thousands of miles from home to fight in climates and landscapes utterly unfamiliar to them. Indian troops endured the freezing winters of the Western Front. West African soldiers fought in brutal trench conditions. Anzac forces landed on the rocky shores of Gallipoli. For some colonial soldiers, recognition after the war was limited or delayed. Their sacrifices were not always fully acknowledged in the years that followed. Yet their names, too, are etched into memorials, proof that the war's reach was global. They also never made it back home. The sea and the sky. While trench warfare dominates popular memory, many soldiers perished at sea and in the air. Sailors aboard battleships and submarines faced sudden death from torpedoes and naval mines. When ships sank, entire crews vanished beneath the waves, leaving no grave but the ocean. In the skies above Europe, early fighter pilots flew fragile wooden biplanes made of canvas and wire. Parachutes were rarely issued. A single bullet or engine failure could send a plane spiraling down in flames. These men were among the first generation of military aviators, pioneers of aerial combat. Many were barely in their 20s. Grief without end. In the aftermath of the war, society struggled to process loss on such an immense scale. Psychological trauma was widespread, not only among veterans but also among civilians. Black clothing became a common sight as widows observed long mourning periods. Photographs of fallen sons were displayed prominently in homes. Some families preserved bedrooms exactly as they had been left, unwilling to disturb the memory. Churches and town halls filled with plaques bearing rows of names. Each inscription represented a life interrupted, a birthday that would never be celebrated, a wedding that would never take place, a child never born. For many, the war did not feel like a chapter that ended. It felt like a wound that never fully healed. Echoes into the present. Today, historians, archaeologists, and genealogists continue to uncover stories of those who never returned. Digital archives allow descendants to trace military records, letters, and battlefield movements. DNA identification has restored names to previously unknown graves. Ceremonies still take place at Verdun, the Somme, Gallipoli, and countless other sites. Students visit cemeteries, walking between rows of white headstones that stretch to the horizon. The repetition of names and dates makes the scale of loss tangible. Yet remembrance is not only about looking backward. The soldiers who never made it back home left a responsibility for the living, to understand the causes of conflict, to value diplomacy, and to recognize the human cost of war before it begins. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the world expected relief. Instead, many nations were confronted with an overwhelming task: accounting for the dead. Governments established commissions to locate, identify, and bury the fallen with dignity. What they discovered was staggering: battlefields littered with bodies, makeshift graves hastily dug during combat, in vast areas too dangerous to enter because of unexploded shells. Teams of workers spent years carefully combing former front lines. Temporary wooden crosses were replaced with permanent headstones. Cemeteries were designed with symmetry and order, perhaps as a way to bring peace to the chaos that had claimed so many lives. Families were often given a difficult choice: have their loved ones' remains returned home, or allow them to rest near where they fell. Many countries, including Britain and its dominions, chose not to repatriate bodies. The fallen would lie beside their comrades, united in death as they had been in service. The mothers who waited among those most deeply affected were the mothers. Across Europe and beyond, women who had waved goodbye at train stations now faced a lifetime of absence. Some became known as Gold Star mothers, a term that symbolized the highest sacrifice a family could make. In the United States, pilgrimages were later organized to allow mothers and widows to visit overseas graves for the first time. For many, the journey was both healing and heartbreaking. They stood before white crosses in foreign soil, touching engraved names with trembling hands. For some, it was the first tangible confirmation that their son's life and death had not been forgotten. Grief became part of national identity. Poems, songs, and ceremonies centered not only on bravery, but on mourning. The children who grew up without fathers. An entire generation grew up shaped by absence. Children who were infants when their fathers marched off to war often knew them only through photographs and stories. Schools held remembrance ceremonies where young boys and girls recited the names of men they had never met. For some families, older siblings stepped into parental roles far too early. Economic hardship compounded emotional loss, especially in regions already struggling from wartime destruction. In countries like France and Germany, where millions of soldiers were killed, the demographic imbalance lasted decades. The shortage of young men influenced marriage patterns, birth rates, and economic recovery. The war's consequences rippled outward in ways that statistics alone cannot fully capture. The psychological wounds of the survivors. Not all who failed to make it back home were those buried in military cemeteries. Many returned physically alive but emotionally scarred beyond recognition. The term shell shock emerged during the war to describe trembling, paralysis, nightmares, and emotional withdrawal. At the time, understanding of psychological trauma was limited. Some soldiers were wrongly accused of cowardice. Others were treated harshly rather than compassionately. Today, we recognize these symptoms as post-traumatic stress. Their suffering reminds us that survival does not always mean recovery. For families, welcoming a soldier home could mean confronting a stranger shaped by horror. The joyful reunions shown in photographs often mask deeper struggles that lasted for years. Art, memory, and meaning. The grief of World War I found expression in art and architecture. Painters depicted shattered landscapes. Writers questioned authority and nationalism. Composers created somber works reflecting collective sorrow. Massive memorials rose in capital cities. The Cenotaph in London, the Menin Gate in Ypres, the Douaumont Ossuary at Verdun, the Liberty Memorial in Kansas City. The Menin Gate alone bears the names of more than 54,000 missing soldiers with no known grave. Each evening, buglers sound the last post beneath its arches, a tradition maintained for generations. These monuments are not celebrations of victory. They are places of reflection. Lessons carved in history. In the years following the war, many people vowed that such devastation must never happen again. The League of Nations was formed with the hope of preventing future global conflict. Yet unresolved tensions, economic instability, and political extremism would eventually lead to another world war. For families who had already lost sons, the outbreak of World War II reopened old wounds. Some households that had lost a father in the First War would later lose a son in the Second. The soldiers who never made it back home from 1914 to 1918 became part of a broader story about the fragility of peace. A century later, more than 100 years have passed since the end of World War I, yet its presence remains. Names are still read aloud during remembrance ceremonies. School children still study letters written from muddy trenches. Archaeologists still recover remains from former battlefields. Descendants still visit cemeteries in quiet reflection. The world has changed in unimaginable ways since 1918, technologically, politically, socially. But the human cost of war